Turn the lights on. I want you to see me. See, this is what I look like.
Qué bonita.
Tomorrow you come to work with us in the factory.
What?
If we don't help your sister, who else is going to?
What do you mean, not going to college?
Anna has an appetite for life.
Are you going to be working here full time?
Just until I find a better job.
Oh, me too. I'm just working here until I win the lottery.
For love.
A nice night tonight.
I guess this is good night.
For ideas.
A man wants a virgin.
You're so old-fashioned. A woman has thoughts, a mind of her own.
Mine? The thoughts?
But not everyone appreciates where it's taking her.
Anna is going to go to college, but not now.
We are a family, and we intend to stay that way.
This is a sweatshop.
I'm grateful for what Ama has taught me, and I'm proud of what I do. Cosa.
Jimmy, does your mom understand you?
You'll never fit into that one. It's a size 7.
It's like she hates me. She thinks I'm fat and I'm ugly and God knows what.
You're not fat. You're beautiful.
You lost your virginity, didn't you?
Mom, you're imagining things.
I can tell. ¿Por qué no te diste tu valor?
You would say that, wouldn't you? I'm not your baby anymore.
What is wrong with your sister? Si te quieres ir, lárgate. Girls nowadays think they know so much.
It's so hot in here.
Look at you. The two of you should lose weight.
This is who we are, Mama.
I look like a cow.
Leslie, shut up.
Look at my hips.
You want to see cellulite? Here we go.
Hannah.
Excuse me, ladies. You want stretch marks?
Estela. Ladies. Look how beautiful we are.
Who cares what we look like?
Just let it all hang out.
You could be beautiful.
Stop it. You're overweight, too. So why should I listen to you?
Real women have curves.
Hannah, don't eat the flan.
Desde que yo llegué acá, siempre dicen que es la época del latino, porque ya va a haber mucho interés en latino, y a pesar de eso las cosas no cambian mucho.
Así que Hollywood siempre ha sido como un lugar de una melancolía infantil para todos nosotros, porque nos hemos criado viendo películas sobre ciudades y conflictos que nos eran lejanos, pero ya en nuestra memoria parecen propios.
Agora, é verdade que cinema brasileiro, esse cinema latino de língua espanhola, é difícil de misturar. Não dá um café com leite, não. Então, isso tem outra, sei lá, é uma coisa da tradição cultural deles, né?
Because we want that point of view. We want the Latino point of view in the usage of this art form. This art form is way too important. This art form is the strongest art form ever created in the history of humankind.
Cuando se hace una película, de cualquier película.
Cualquier.
Mira, México, yo pienso en Chilango, sueño en Chilango. Yo creo que mal hablo el español, mal hablo el inglés, pero mi inglés, además, sobre todo cuando estoy trabajando, lo masacro todavía más con expresiones chilangas, mexicanas y demás. Entonces, hay una parte que está ahí todo el tiempo.
Siempre quiero hablar de mi país. No quiero hablar de otra cosa, que siempre quiero contar algún México que veo. Siempre hay algo que digo, ahora voy a hablar de esta parte de México, o de este lugar, o de este aspecto de mi propia cultura. En cualquier película filmada o no filmada, siempre ha sido así.
Yo reconocí a mi país gracias a ver las películas. A mí me hicieron reconocer el rostro de mi país, de mi ciudad, de mis necesidades, de mis deseos y de mis anhelos.
Yo soy mexicanísima, por supuesto, mexicanísima por todos los contactos, pero mi nación es el español, en la lengua española, que en España le dicen castellano por problemas de nacionalismo, pero la mayoría de los que lo hablamos de este lado del Atlántico le decimos español.
But I'm a filmmaker that wants to talk about the human condition in a universal way. I do films about Latinos and because that's who I am. But I believe if you tell the story of your village, you tell the story of the world.
I try to find the common denominator that connects us to everybody. And some of that is an understanding of the history, some of that is understanding of human nature.
Y a mí me gusta el poder participar no solamente en la conversación de mi país, sino también en la conversación del mundo, porque México es parte del mundo. Y creo que es ahí donde tenemos que conversar también, porque todo nos afecta. Ya no estamos aislados, ni somos un país ajeno, ni somos una isla.
De conocer otras culturas, otros lugares. El cine es importantísimo. Pero que hay un tipo de cine o de lo que quieras decir que a veces sí tiene que ser muy particularmente hecho en Latinoamérica.
Eu percebi que o mundo é muito mais gigante do que um modelo e um gênero, sabe? Não há uma forma de amar, né? De gostar, de querer, de olhar, de fazer, de dizer. Graças a Deus que somos diferentes.
Good afternoon. My name is Randy Haberkamp. I'm the Managing Director of Preservation and Foundation Programs for the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Thank you all for being here today. I just want to say I think we all pick up, well, maybe you don't pick up a newspaper anymore. Maybe you pick up a newspaper, or maybe you look at your phone. I don't know. Or maybe you watch television or your computer. But we all read the news and think, where are all the smart people? They're all here today. So thank you for being with us. This is the beginning of the Academy's portion of the citywide, region-wide, actually, celebration that has been sponsored and coordinated by the Getty, called Pacific Standard Time Latin America Los Angeles, or PST LALA, for those of us who are really cool and hip. And so we're very happy to begin it with something that is specifically designed to be long-lasting beyond what happens within these four walls this afternoon. We will be discussing a book that the Academy has published. We will be meeting the authors of the various chapters of this book, and best yet, you all get to take a copy home for free, okay? The book, of course, yes, nothing like a free book. Especially one that is on an interesting topic that we're all anxious to read from the minds of people who know something about that in great detail. So thank you for being here. Thank you to the Getty for not only inspiring this wonderful citywide, region-wide celebration, but thank you to the Getty for including film in the word art celebration. We're one of 3 film organizations that are an integral part of more than 70 that are participating. And the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences couldn't be more happy to have film, especially in a celebration of Los Angeles art, be a major part of this festival. It's so easy to think of fine art and to leave out some of the popular arts and or things that are really fine art maybe once in a while that don't get recognized that way. So thank you, thank you, thank you to the Getty. And thank you all for being here this afternoon. We also want to thank Bank of America for being the primary sponsor of this event. The thing that's great for me is that those of you who know anything about Hollywood history know that the Bank of America has always been a founder of film productions and financing of film. So what could be better than to have Bank of America prove their continuing interest in the arts and film as well. So thank you to Bank of America. You each got a little booklet here. Most importantly, it tells you about what our upcoming screenings will be. This is not the greatest lecture hall in the world because it's a little big and barn-like right now, but it is the best place you can possibly see a motion picture in the world. This is a great screen. We have a great projection system. Can handle just about anything that you can throw at us. Better yet, and more in a diminishing sense, the thing that's really so great is we have great projectionists. It's a lost and dying art form. So especially when you talk about film projection and being able to do multiple gauges and handle all the various things that are necessary to have a historical retrospective. So we're very happy to have this facility. I know there are people who have looked at the list of films we've said and said, well, I've seen those. Probably not. You probably have not seen them all on a screen like this. You probably also have not seen them in quite a while. You probably also have not seen them in the same context that we live in today that may be worth reviewing what's going on here. I doubt you've seen all of them, really. I think there's probably a few you've missed. And so I hope you'll not only come to see some old favorites, but to experience a film that you may not have seen before or that you only saw on television or DVD or whatever at home. And I hope you'll spread that word to especially younger viewers, the younger potential audience members that you know. The hope of all of the things we do here at the Academy is to pass the torch, so to speak, to the future generations. And the way to do that is for mothers and grandmothers and friends to bring people who have not seen the films or who have only watched them on their phones or who only know a little bit about it to experience something new. There is something about the communal experience of these films that's very unique to us. And you are now ambassadors for this program to help us have these screenings be as influential and as well attended as the Getty and the Academy hope. So, without further ado, we're going to get on with the course of our business. I will say that our opening screening on Monday night is of Zoot Suit. Luis Valdez and Edward James Olmos and others will be here. It will also be recorded for broadcast on The Frame on KPCC. So you have multiple ways of experiencing that and joining in the festivities. Today, as I said, we're going to have a discussion. We have another panel tonight called The Latina Experience in Hollywood. And it will be quite a feisty panel, I think. I'm very excited about it. So I hope you'll come back for that. And in the meantime, I want to thank probably one of the most guiding forces of our programs here today. She's going to speak today and serve as moderator for this panel. She is a documentary filmmaker, which is one way to identify her. She is a very courageous and passionate woman, which is another way to identify her. She was born in Mexico, but has lived in the United States, so that's yet another way to identify her. But I think the most important way to identify her, and she's also an Academy Award nominee, which is another way to identify her. I think the best way to identify her, however, is just somebody that is a great person to sit down and talk with and have lunch with and to get to know, and who has very strong opinions, has a very strong example that she sets, and most of all is here today to share that with you. Please welcome Lourdes Portillo.
Thank you, Randy. I'm deeply grateful to the Academy for having invited me to curate, together with Ellen Harrington, a series of oral histories with Latin American directors. Oh, I'm going to lower this a little bit. Right? Producers and screenwriters as well, that contributes to an unprecedented archive for public access and scholarly inquiry about Latinos in film. This project involved the participation of nearly 50 members of the Academy's professional staff across a dozen departments. It was an enormous project, And I would like to begin by acknowledging their contribution to this effort. In particular, I would like to thank Don Mori as our grants director, who brought the Getty's Pacific Standard opportunity to the attention of the Academy, and that was the engine of its success. Thank you, Don. This is the beginning of a cinematic resource that truly represents and mirrors this multicultural nation. Our selection of films connects to the filmmakers who participated in our Oral History project and reflects a time and period in Latin America and Los Angeles from 1967 to 2006. Along with their oral histories, these artists' films reflect a new direction in production that engages literature, history, and open sexuality. For the first time, women filmmakers are represented in significant numbers, and thematically they are more daring than ever. I appreciate the profundity of the approach in view of the general absence of Latino oral history subjects in the Academy. Rather than doing perfunctory interviews with familiar stories and remaining on the surface, this project demands digging deeper. It's deeper in the sense that the directors, producers, and writers participated in a long-form oral history of up to 5 hours. It took the form of a thoughtful, engaged conversation, not an interrogation. Such an approach inevitably unearths unexpected but deeply felt subjects that influence their lives and help them become who they are. For me, it was an enormous pleasure to take what I've learned over the years in documentary filmmaking and refine it, deepening the notion of what it is to interview, what it means to ask very personal questions, to look for sincerity, to look for inspiration, for dreams, for beauty and storytelling, to recount memories and adapt them to one's work. It was equally gratifying to see the love of storytelling and construction of language. So I'm hoping that you, like me, can relish these enormously compelling characters and allow yourself to dream of what will be their next cinematic creation. Excuse me, it's hot here. It's hot in the light. The oral histories were the source material that a group of film scholars used as inspiration for their essays that are now collected in the form of a book, which you will have as a gift, as the audience can have the pleasure of reading the scholars' interpretation of their context. The book, website, the film restorations, and screening series are the fruit of our combined labor. You will also be able to view their films over the next 3 months in a comprehensive series and hear from many of these artists in person during onstage conversations during their screenings. So make sure to come to the screenings. We're so pleased that you're here this afternoon to hear the conversations we have planned between these authors. And I hope that you will ask your questions to them at the end of the panel discussion. We want this dialogue to be multi-directional and include all voices. Further, all the material used in this project is available freely to anyone through our website. As for those of you who made the effort to join us here today, each of you will, well, you know that you will receive a book, only one book, but I've said it twice, so it's not 2 books. In this effort to rectify Latino abscess on the screen, I feel that now is the moment to embrace this important step and gesture of commitment on the part of the Academy and support it. While California will soon have a majority Latino population, Latinos on and behind the camera have been mostly absent since the invention of cinema, really. Consequently, there is a lot of work to be done. I reiterate that we as Latinos are also part of the United States, as well as Latin America, and we're glad that you're here to see the work that we've created together. Thank you. Let me introduce the first panel moderator, Jimmy Mendiola, independent filmmaker and curator, director of the San Antonio Cine Festival in Texas. Thank you, Jimmy.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you, Lourdes, and thank you all the people that brought us out here. I'm really appreciative to participate in the Pacific Standard Time. I'm in Texas now. I lived in LA, so reading all the exciting things that are happening here is really great, and I'm glad to be part of it. So thanks again. As Lourdes said, what we're going to talk about today is the connection between Latin American cinema and filmmaking in the United States, which by the nature of the film industry itself means, for the most part, the connection between Latin American cinema and Los Angeles. So we're going to begin our conversation with this panel, and there's going to be a panel right afterwards. So what I'd like to do is bring up the three essayists that are part of this initial discussion. First up, we have Carrie Beecham, who wrote In the Beginning, From Latin America to Hollywood. So Carrie there she is. And next up, Jose Sanchez, who wrote The New Latin American Film Movement, Influences Received, Shared, and Gained. And then rounding out the panel, Catherine Benamou, who wrote Reverse Angle, Contracamo, Latin American Filmmakers in Vision Hollywood. So what we're going to start off with is we're going to have each of the writers sort of briefly introduce what their essay's about. And then after that, I got a series of questions. We'll start having the conversation. We'll get a bit more in depth into some of the ideas that they're exploring. So, and we kind of designed it a little bit historically, in historically linear fashion. So Carrie's going to start with talking about the silent era. Then we'll get into the new Latin American cinema movement with Jose, and then a little bit more contemporary Latin American cinema with Catherine. So we can start with Carrie.
Thank you very much. And I really want to say what an honor it is to be included with this group, what a joy it's been to work with everyone over the past few years, and really want to thank the Academy for putting the focus on this. I'm so excited about often in film history, and you slice and dice in ways I kind of roll my eyes about, but this is so important, and I'm so excited about particularly the oral histories. I mean, that's something that's going to be able to be used for generations to come, and the screenings are going to be fun. The book is thrilling, but those oral histories, wow. Well, first I have to start with the premise that it's kind of a misnomer, because Latin American culture was here for centuries before Hollywood was. So it's not, it's not one came to the other. And what's interesting, I think, too, is that filmmaking originally, just to set the tone with a couple of touchstones quickly, filmmaking initially was very disdained. People who came here were even the fringes of an already disdained industry. Filmmaking was really created by predominantly women and Jews, people who were not welcome in other professions. It just happened to be this incredible coming together in history where these creative souls came to California and ended up, much to their surprise, creating an industry. And it really is true that in 1915, if you were looking for a place to live, you would see signs that said, "No actors, Jews, or dogs." But something happened, other thing happened in 1915, and that was, of course, World War I was raging in Europe. In 1915, European films were far superior to those we were creating in America. But by 1919, their industry had been ravaged. 90% of all films were made in America, of the entire world's films were made in America. And by 1920, there's over 100 filmmaking companies in Los Angeles. Filmmaking has become all of a sudden not so disdained because it is the major industry in the town. And it's all of a sudden feeding those hotels and restaurants and everything else. So all of a sudden people are appreciating it, if still a little bit leery of it. What we also need to remember, I think, about particularly 1920, is there's over 15,000 theaters in America. Most people in America have not gone more than 5 miles from where they were born, okay? All of a sudden, you can go around the corner, put down your dime or your quarter, and the world is revealed to you. And that's all kinds of worlds. Yes, it's Paris, it's London, it's New York, places where somebody born and raised in Des Moines would never see. But you're also being taught stereotypes, romanticism in a way. You're seeing, women are seeing all of a sudden these furs and jewels and a life that they never could have imagined. It's this whole shake up the world view. And as I say, it's available for $25 around the corner. Scared a hell of a lot of people. Now, back in Los Angeles, before there was central casting, the central casting office ended up opening in the middle to late 20s. But before then, even though stereotyping was alive and well in the casting of these films, each group had a place to go to be cast. For Latinos, it was the corner of Temple and Diamond. You'd gather there in the morning, and if a particular filmmaker, remember there's 100 companies working, needs Latinos, they knew to go to Temple and Diamond where they could pull up the truck and round them up. For Africans Americans, it was at the corner in South Central. For men on horses, it was over on Gower. That's how films were cast. That's how absolutely loosey-goosey much of the business was. And that all changed, of course, in the 1920s and the late 20s when sound came in. Because when sound came in, money was required like they hadn't seen before. Wall Street invested. It became a real business. White men wanted the jobs. The women were massively reduced in the behind-the-scenes roles. And it was suddenly a very different world, and they cared a lot. We'll talk later about the way that silent films were made and the rush to make other foreign language films and trying, again, for the profit. But fear really permeated Hollywood from the late 20s on. Very briefly, some of the Latino actors who really did thrive. There was Dolores Del Rio, and Gilbert Roland stretched his career from silence through television, which is unbelievable. Roman Navarro played Frenchmen, Russians, Egyptians. It didn't really seem to matter. He could play anything. And yet on the other side, there was Lupe Velez, who was ultimately stereotyped in everything and billed as the Mexican Spitfire. So while we've had many, many changes in Hollywood over the last 100 years, I would say that one thing that hasn't really changed, and it's been a roller coaster, and we're still fighting, is stereotyping, not just, of course, of Latinos, but of almost everyone. Thank you.
I also want to thank the Academy for doing this cultural event, which benefits many people. And thank you to the organizers who did a wonderful job. The title of my essay is The New Latin American Cinema Movement, Influences Received, Shared, and Given. The new Latin American cinema was discovered in Europe in the 1960s with the Great Young Filmmakers Award given to Bolivia's Jorge Sanginés for his film Ucamao, a war in the language of the Aymara people of the Andes, expressing that's the way it is. And the Best Director Award given to Brazil's Glauber Rocha for Antonio das Mortes, both at the Cannes Film Festival. This movement was born out of the filmmakers' desire to create a new cinema that would reflect the reality of what was happening in the countries. According to Nancy Caro Hollander, quote, the new Latin American cinema movement emerged in the cultural ferment from the late 60s to produce feature films from Latin American audiences that explore the historical forces responsible for poverty, class antagonism, and political repression, end of quote. The work of Sanginés and Rocha, as well as other filmmakers like Cuba, Tomás Gutiérrez Alea, provoked thought by not conforming to European or Hollywood cinema. My essay explores some of the influences received, shared, and given by the new Latin American cinema movement, focusing primarily on the period from the 1960s to the 80s. The films addressed have been selected to illustrate recurring themes in the work of both Latin American filmmakers and Latino filmmakers in LA. Two essential themes developed by the new Latin American cinema movement are reclaiming cultural identity and film as an expression of historical reality. Jorge Rufinelli's statement about the documentary The Battle of Chile by Patricio Guzmán is relevant. Quote, "Without this film, perhaps those years will not exist," end of quote. In the 1960s, Latin American filmmakers developed realist cinema that used experimentation to create authentic images. The new Latin American cinema movement, which includes Brazil's Cinema Novo, was influenced by the cinema of India's Satyajit Ray, as well as films from Hollywood and the French New Wave. Another strong influence was Italian neorealism, particularly in his humanistic approach to the development of characters and stories. During the 1960s and 70s, Cuba provided a hub of connection between Latin America and Latinos in the US. In 1964, Luis Valdés traveled to Cuba with a group called Student Committee to Travel to Cuba. He talks about the effect of the trip, quote, "It created Latin America for me. It opened my eyes to the fact that I was really a Latin American, Latino, you know, in that sense, really, in a worldwide sense," end of quote. At that time, Latin American filmmakers felt the need to have their own film festival that could provide common ground for filmmakers from Latin America and other countries. Director Jesus Treviño served on the Cuban-sponsored Latin American Filmmakers Committee, which helped to develop the festival. My essay goes on to explore how Jorge Sanginés and Luis Valdés were making films alongside the people by allowing the community to have a voice through their films. Both filmmakers work in collaboration with communities their work represented. Sanginés with the Ucamao group on films such as The Courage of the People, and Valdés with the Teatro Campesino, as well as on I Am Joaquin and Sud Sud. In the case of both filmmakers, their work was shared through community screenings that also serve a function of building a community. Some films mentioned which address the themes of reclaiming cultural identity include I Am Joaquin and Sanginés' Clandestine Nation, The Courage of the People, deals with historical reconstruction, as does The Ballad of Gregorio Cortés, directed by Robert Young and starring Edward James Olmos. Sud Sud addresses both reclaiming cultural identity and historical reconstruction. An additional theme considered is how films give voice to the voiceless, using the examples of Gregorio Nava's El Norte. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first I'd like to thank Lourdes Portillo, Ellen Harrington, and Randy Handicamp for initiating this project, moving it forward. It's really been an honor to work with them and also with the other essayists, and I'm really glad we have a Tejano here with us today. My point of departure was that my understanding from speaking my first conversation with Lourdes was that this could lead to the creation of a transfronterizo or cross-border pan-Latino American space for artistic dialogue and historical reconstruction. And I'm really glad that this is a sustainable project and that it's thinking about preservation and education and not just about a celebration in 2017. And how to approach this, since we are creating this frame, well, to return the gaze. There's been so much scholarship from North America looking at Latin American cinema history, looking at Hollywood's portrayal of Latin Americans and Latinx people, and even looking at the Chicanx film movement. And I really was wondering if we could sort of incorporate a different perspective if we start from a reverse angle. And this is not only to increase attention to the role of directors, screenwriters, and performers in shaping the relationship between Latin America and Hollywood, to give them a certain kind of agency in historical narration, following the example of Lourdes's wonderful oral histories, but also to uncover experiences and aspects of these encounters and Hollywood's influence that have been overlooked in the historical record. So I wanted to ask the question, what is the place of Hollywood in the creative imaginary and career trajectories of very diverse Latin American filmmakers? And I think the oral histories help to reveal this. I also wanted to cast the net broadly and consider works including Mexican B-movies that might fall outside of the canon, and as well as possible links between independent film practice and Latin American inroads and pro-Latinx initiatives in Hollywood. And finally, and also the relationship of Brazilians to this enterprise. As you saw in the introduction, there are Brazilians included in the oral histories: Nelson Pereira dos Santos, the great Cinema Novo director, Hector Babenco, who works across the Tordesillas line in both Portuguese and Spanish. I wanted to contemplate, finally, how the city of Los Angeles has historically served as a destination for many film viewers of Latin American and Chicanx origin, as well as a site for audiovisual production for Latin American filmmakers. So where to start? Well, I wanted to start right in the middle of the period that is being considered, 1967 to 2017, to focus on the 80s without regret, in a way. And this was a very effervescent decade for Latinx filmmaking in Hollywood. It was also a decade where Latin American filmmakers that were achieving feature film production in Latin American national industries were able to try their hand at filmmaking here. There was a shift then in Hollywood industrial policy toward greater inclusiveness of Latinx representation that was known as the Hispanic Decade, and we were sort of kicking off the series with Zoot Suit, which also helped to kick off the Hispanic Decade. There was also a decentering of Mexican film production in the wake of the duck crisis, accompanied by coarse border productions located partially in Los Angeles, and the migration of Latin American auteurs to Los Angeles and Sundance to begin developing new forms of transnational cinema. And so Hector Babenco was one, Bruno Barreto from Brazil was another, Sergio Arau from, Alfonso Arau from Mexico was another. The 1980s were also a very difficult and painful time in Latin America, especially in Guatemala, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, that had or were experiencing the effects of military dictatorships, and those effects also had an effect on artistic production. But it was also a very hopeful time toward the end of the decade, where there were proactive attempts to enfranchise disadvantaged racial and ethnic groups along with women in national political processes. Some countries, such as Brazil, rewrote their constitution. And finally, the Mexican Constitution, at the end of the decade, included indigenous identity as a possible ethnic identity. So how to make sense of these parallel developments? At what points might they be found to intersect? That was my question. In the 80s, a lot was happening here in Los Angeles, just as the Hispanic Decade was happening. We have new waves of Mexican and Central American migration here, and changes in immigration policy, of course, in the middle of the decade, and economic production. And this is depicted in film like Born in East LA. We see that the Latino presence is very strong, but at the same time that there's an urban rebordering happening. And as a counterpoint to this rebordering, we have both the expression of muralists, and there's some wonderful exhibits as part of PSTLA about the Los Angeles murals, including one that's being reconstructed that was next to Roosevelt High School in Boyle Heights, as well as performers, such as Maria Elena Velasco, film performers, who was herself a film director from Mexico, Rosa Gloria Chaguayan, who's a wonderful bee superheroine, known as Lola la Trailera in popular parlance from Mexico, Edward James Olmos, who I think is the face of the Latinx 80s for us, and Chish Marin, who made this sort of symbolic gesture of, well, I'm going to cross the border back into Mexico and see what happens in Born East LA. And finally, I'd like to sort of pay a little tribute to Lupe Ontiveros. She was an incredibly important actress in the 80s. She was in so many films. She was the face of Chicanx motherhood. She was the face of matriarchal values and power. And she was in so many films, and it's really was great to be able to go back to those performances. Okay, so the next step was to think about how do we get at different modes of engagement? How do we get away from the idea of Hollywood as just a hegemonic power versus Latin American cinema as an alternative cinema that is resisting Hollywood? How do we look at the complex engagement that actually took place between both Latin American filmmakers and Latinx filmmakers in this time? So we begin to see how the film cultures between Latin America and Hollywood have actually become intertwined, and they were intertwined during this decade, even as strong oppositional movements developed in areas of struggle that were ignored by film industries were beginning to be addressed in the 80s by a burgeoning video-driven community-based media movement. So I decided to take what I call in my essay a parallax view. On the one hand, that would include both filmmakers and their audiences here. On the one hand, cinephilic memory. As cinephiles, this is the first point of contact, really, between many of these filmmakers and Hollywood. They would go to the movies, and they each had their favorite movies. And you can find this out if you watch the Oral Histories. And secondly, migration and displacement with Los Angeles as a destination. Some filmmakers came early in their lives. Some had relatives from Mexico and went back to visit their relatives in Mexico and began to create films with that in mind. And some went relatively late in life professionally. There is, and the second sort of premises that I adopted was there's no direct line necessarily between cinephilia and film text. Engagement can take many different forms. Nelson Pereira dos Santos was an apprentice here. He learned filmmaking here. Transnational collaboration, for example, between Greg Nava and Berta Navarro in Mexico. There were some that relied on Hollywood for marketing and distribution, such as Ramon Menendez and Stand and Deliver. Some who thought about counter-appropriation, of taking some of the skills and the techniques and really creating new messages. I would include Alex Rivera in that, and some who worked on parody. The Brazilians are perhaps the kings of parody in this regard. Creative parody, which shows their ambivalence toward the power of Hollywood, but also their admiration for some of the genre cinema. And some who cite Hollywood, who include references to Hollywood, such as Marisol Trujillo in Cuba, Rogério Scanzella in Brazil, Luis Ospina in Colombia. And some who also wish to pay homage to commemorate, such as Hector Babenco. Okay, do I have a minute? Sorry.
Minute.
Okay, a minute. Lastly, there were two discoveries. One was the importance of the 80s, for it was a queer turn in Latin American cinema. Before we had major feature films in the United States, there were filmmakers in Mexico who were making films about gay family, about trans people being social outcasts in small pueblos. And they really sort of forged the way so that a queer discourse could appear in commercial cinema. So I'm speaking about Arturo Ripstein's work in El Lugar Sin Límites, Doña Erlinda y su Hijo, Jaime Humberto Hermosillo, and Fresa y Chocolate by Titon in Cuba. And secondly, I was really surprised myself seeing Kiss of the Spider Woman, how much my opinion of that film changed when I recontextualize it in this history. I don't have time to talk about that a lot, but it's really an allegorical film that allows us to think of all forms of military repression, whether it happens in Argentina or Brazil, and how homophobia is part of that repression. And the second thing was an appreciation for the public funding we had in the 80s. And the fact that, in fact, in doing this history, I had to think back of what we were doing in New York, creating a screening series, setting up 16 projectors, trying to create a context of reception in this country, and how we took for granted that the New York State Council on the Arts might provide funding for subtitling these movies. And how Ruby Rich really helped that process, and how technologically sensitive that project was, because people didn't have access to video. They didn't have access yet to digital online media. So I've got a new appreciation for the real importance of public funding that we had that was somehow taken away from us since then.
Yeah, to echo that, I mean, a lot of the important Chicano films of the 80s were public TV films, The Ballad of Gregorio Cortez. Some of the movies you guys are going to see in this next 3 months, public money went into to giving opportunity to U.S. Latino filmmakers in creating this body of work that's pretty interesting. A couple of things before I move on. I mean, listening to the essays, it's a really big topic, and we're not going to cover it in the time we have here. It's very rich, and it's really interesting. Reading some of the essays, I'm just reminded of works that I haven't seen in a long time, and you're right, recontextualizing them for now is really important. And I think that's why this discussion is important, because whether we're talking about oppositional cinema and Latin American cinema, it suggests that there's something to oppose, and whether these are cinemas that are trying to create their own new language, it's always in opposition to Hollywood, and that's not necessarily bad, I think, and I think it kind of underlies what we're talking about. But I think it also affords us, in this discussion, in later discussions especially, is remembering that we're still not represented on the screen, and that's the whole reason we're here, and that's the value of this whole endeavor. And in particular, I just want to emphasize, if you guys have a chance Monday, I just found out that they're going to show Zoot Suit, which is a great film, but before it, they're gonna screen I Am Joaquin. And I Am Joaquin, which was Luis Valdez's first film, it's completely restored. It's so, I'm really sad I'm not going to be here. I mean, it's going to show. All that exists now are like these cheap copies upon copies and on YouTube. But if you have a chance Monday, come see it. It's a really great film. I want to go back to what you were saying, Carrie. We had a discussion earlier, and you said a lot of these decisions and these things, artistic otherwise, come down to money. And you mentioned in your piece that silent pictures weren't dependent on dialogue, and changing the title cards was relatively easy and cheap. So you could send a film to Mexico and Germany, the same movie, and it was kind of. Can you talk about how important the foreign market was to silent films, and about the transition to sound and the various strategies that studios used to sort of fill that gap that they suddenly felt they had to send movies in countries' own languages.
I find it fascinating, really. I didn't do anything, so I don't know if it's up there or what. Oh, there we go. Thank you. At one point, after like a year, because it took that long, films would be sent to the biggest cities, they'd be sent back. Then copies were sent to the hinterland and sent back. I mean, one of the reasons when films are now discovered they're found in Australia is because that was the last place they were sent, and it wasn't worth spending the postage on sending it back. Same with Alaska. So it went that was the distribution. But at one point, it was up to 70% of the studio's profits came from international distribution, which is, pretty important. And when all you had to do was change this little title card, it was a breeze. So needless to say, sound films was yet another reason to be scared. And to be honest, I think most of them didn't have the slightest idea what they were doing. Many studios tried to make multiple versions of the same film. I mean, for instance, MGM's one of their big hits of 1930 was The Big House. They made it in German, they made it in French, they made it in Spanish. I think they did it in 5 languages with different actors, but often using the same sets or bringing things back. The best, I think, example is at Universal, where Dracula was remade. So we've got the Bela Lugosi film being made by day with a budget of about $350,000. And then the Lupita Tovar version being filmed at night with a budget of $60,000. Now, granted, they're using the same set, but the 24 hours they're filming. And I love to use the example of Dracula because many people think that the Spanish version is the superior film, a little darker, a little more risque, and just plain old a lot of fun. And it, I think, ended up making more money than the English version did. But in their frantic making of these movies, and then distribution, of course, is changing too, because you can't just send all films to all places. All of a sudden, you've got this Spanish in places to send in English. I mean, in German goes to Germany, and then that's in early 30s. That's already starting to change. Garbo's a huge star, but all of a sudden, once Hitler comes to power, they don't want any American films. So all these dynamics are at work and really scaring them to the point that they find that the Spanish circuit, so all of a sudden there is a Spanish circuit of theaters, of course, showing Spanish-speaking films, which they hadn't had before. They'd had neighborhood theaters, and of course, but now it's films for Spanish speakers. And instead of providing, Hollywood tried for a few years to provide that, but what ends up happening is Mexico and then Argentina and Spain become the bastions of Spanish-speaking filmmaking, and they end up in the first of 102 Ironies, they end up sending those films to America, and they're providing the Spanish-speaking circuit with those films and doing what becomes a hell of a job. I mean, really much more interesting films, I think, than you would have necessarily seen if that had stayed in Hollywood.
What, did the language having to suddenly speak, were there silent Latin stars, Mexican stars that didn't make the transition because of language or accents?
Or accents, and it wasn't just Spanish, it was everybody. I mean, the Talmadge girls were huge silent stars, but their Bronx accents, got them out really quickly. And the sound equipment itself wasn't necessarily very good, so oftentimes, we hear about Jack Gilbert and his high-pitched voice, but I think that's been shown to just be the sound equipment itself was the problem. So there was a lot of blame going around, a lot of finger pointing going around. And so the transition was much more individual with the studios and with the actors than any monolithic conclusions about that, I think. I'm
going to switch over to Jose, and there's a really famous quote that Jesus Trevino, the U.S., the Mexican-American filmmaker, said where Chicano cinema, he felt, was the northernmost expression of Latin American cinema. I'm wondering if you could kind of expand a little bit about, you talk about the two themes, reclaiming cultural identity and expressing historical reality as consistent themes through these various films from Latin America. How did that influence, or if it did, Chicano cinema, or that first, U.S. Latinos making movies that were looking to Latin America for inspiration?
Well, reclaiming cultural identity was important for the Chicanos because it was important for them to be seen as, let me see, to feel basically part of the rest of the place, of society. And one saw that experience, for example, when Trevino goes to Cuba, because Cuba was a common ground for Latin Americans and filmmakers in LA also to be able to see there, other people making movies, other cultures, and the things that those people also in Latin America were dealing with. They were similar to the ones that, Chicanos in the US were dealing. So they did, in a way, basically, that helped them realize they weren't just them,
right,
struggling with those things.
Yeah, it was interesting in your piece that I read, and I guess you got it from the interviews. I didn't realize Luis Valdez had visited Cuba in 1964, which predates I Am Joaquin. So I'm just curious, if there's connection or some kind of.
Yeah, there's gotta be a connection because he feels it was a unique experience for him. He felt he was a Latin American. He felt that he was a Latino, and also he could interact with other people there and get some information about what they were doing in Latin America.
Yeah, and Catherine, you talked a little bit about Cheech Marin and his movie, and it's kind of surprising that it played at the Havana International Film Festival and was accorded. Yes, it won awards, and they recognized it. I mean, they didn't, I guess, read him as this guy making pot movies. It was sort of, it was a comedy, but there was some ideas behind what he was doing.
Yeah. In a way, it was kind of a refreshing change from some other movies. But yeah, I think this idea of pan-Latinidad sort of is beginning to circulate more. We talk about the early 60s and how important that was in terms of individual directors' experience, but I think the discourse of pan-Latinidad is really beginning to circulate in the 80s as we have filmmakers like Greg Nava going to Mexico, making a film about Guatemalan refugees, as we have Cheech Marin thinking, okay, and that's precisely, I think, a key point of his film is that I can't just be comfortable. I'm from East LA. I need to start thinking about those in my family and those in the community, right, who may not be from East LA, and to immerse myself in that. And so he's thinking about this identity as being a cross-border kind of identity. And thinking about Lourdes's first film, Después del Terremoto, is about Nicaraguan refugees in San Francisco. And so we see these Latinx filmmakers really initiating this concern with migration and starting to think more hemispherically. And also Lourdes' initiative to go down to Argentina. And I just went to Buenos Aires and went to Ex-ESMAS. And I think it's just amazing. I learned a lot about what happened during that period, and I just think it's amazing that Lourdes was able to go there with 16mm film and to film Las Madres and to somehow make that extremely relevant to women and others who were concerned with human rights here in the United States at that time. So I think there was a lot of filmmakers and film curators who were trying to reframe what Latin American cinema was so that it could be embraced by a U.S. audience.
Carrie, I know you talked a little bit about it, but can you kind of expand on that void that was suddenly existed by the studios not being able to produce Spanish language movies, and then the emergence of a Mexican cinema, and particularly there was a circuit in the Southwest, right, where they were showing Spanish language movies to Mexican American audiences?
Oh, absolutely. That all of a sudden, that became you know, the answer to 9 out of 10 questions is follow the money. I mean, all of a sudden there was the economic void. They needed those theaters. And in Hollywood itself, I've quite a bit on, or in Los Angeles itself, there was a fairly vibrant for a decade or so of Spanish theaters and different impresarios. You know, a Spanish-speaking Sid Roman type who, you know, built, tried to build large theaters, and that worked for a while. I think a couple of the things are really important about, in some ways I'm kind of grateful about Hollywood's failure to continue to make simply duplicate copies of their own stories in different languages, even though some of them are fascinating to watch. I mean, I just watched Garbo's German version of Anna Christie, and it's darker, it's different, it's grittier. She made films in multiple languages, as did Gilbert Roland, for instance, and Ramon Navarro. But what I think is interesting is it all of a sudden, when the filmmaking moves to Mexico, and the other thing we have to remember, too, that I haven't seen mentioned is what an important role Mexico played in with the Hollywood 10, with the whole, where, you know, Trumbo and the whole gang of people moved down there and stay down there for a while. Mm-hmm. And, of course, Louis Buñuel gets, I mean, Mexico was like a petri dish for so many different kinds of filmmakers, and it was so important in different ways that provided that base. But the good news about failing to simply remake their own movies, as successful as they might have been, gave to Latin America, and particularly Mexico and Argentina and Spain, chances to create their own stories and show their own stories and ship those stories into America and reverse this trend, which was so resisted by so many, of America simply shipping their stories to the entire world. I mean, a lot of people felt very mixed to begin with about, I mean, Lillian Gish said that sound killed the international language of film. It had been, Mary Pickford said sound was like putting lipstick on the Venus de Milo. What are we doing? Why are we ruining this gorgeous art form? And it really was becoming a gorgeous art form in the late 20s with fabulous films. You know, The Big Parade, The Wind, etc. Just beautiful films. And then when sound came, they almost had to start over. So anyway, there's just so many little things that I think are such interesting subjects for investigation for later.
As I said, you know, this is a very, very brief amount of time. We're not going to be able to cover all of Latin American cinema. I did, though, want to end with one question, perhaps to Catherine, about you talk about, you know, the points of intersections you found between Latin America and U.S. Latino filmmakers. I'm just curious, what were those points, and more importantly, how can they inspire like a new movement of filmmaking and exchange, and then more importantly, help rectify the absence of Latinos on U.S. cinema?
Okay, well, one of the points of intersection was, of course, this theme of migration, which I think occurs both in Latin American cinema and in Latino cinema at that time, concerned with human rights. I mean, and this is coming out of the Chicanx movement and the Puerto Rican movement. I think people got it. They got the effort to portray those struggles in Mexico and Brazil and Argentina. I think also this idea that you can create, that you can bring your ideas, your culture, your ideas of how to use technology and technique to a sort of commercial filmmaking situation and engage creatively with those influences that you got from it. And I guess the next thing is that just as it really took, you know, the sort of Chicanx film movement in the 60s and 70s to create the Hispanic Decade. I mean, they were there, they were ready for it, but they were ready because they had been very active in their communities before. And so I don't think we should forget the importance of that we need independent filmmaking, that it feeds major filmmaking in certain ways, and that we need to be open to those channels of communication. And the next thing is, I think, definitely think hemispherically. Don't just think about, I mean, I think the local is extremely important. The translocal is very important. And I think with recent events, I think we're becoming more aware of that. And I think this idea of needing to travel, that if you're filming, travel is good, I think that continues to be true. And I think we need to create different venues, located in different places for that conversation to continue.
Well, let's give our writers a big round of applause. I encourage you to read all the essays in the book you're going to get. It's amazing stuff. You'll learn lots, and it's entertaining, and it's provocative, and it's fun. So again, thank you guys. What's going to happen now is we're going to hand it over to the next panel, but before that starts, we're going to see some clips. So again, thank you guys so much.
Y para mí el cine es una construcción, un proceso de pensamiento. Y yo no creo que el pensamiento esté exento de emoción. O sea, no es algo frío, lejano. Para mucha gente mis películas son frías porque no hay música, no veo el sufrimiento romántico que tienen algunas otras películas, pero bueno, es otra cosa. Pero sí lo que creo es que las películas son un proceso de pensamiento donde durante unas 2 horas, hora y media, uno comparte con el espectador no tanto una historia, sino como una forma en que se construyen las cosas.
Un guión original uno lo piensa básicamente en imágenes y con largo del cine, con la extensión propia de una historia para contarse en 1 hora y media, 2 horas. Adaptar es muy difícil, básicamente por una razón, que es la novela, que es de donde se adapta generalmente, y el cine, el lenguaje de la novela y el lenguaje del cine no solo no son iguales, son antípodas. En el lenguaje de la novela, la trama central es el tronco, florece en un montón de ramas que son las historias secundarias que enriquecen al tronco. El cine más bien es como un árbol en donde las tramas secundarias son raíces que tienen que fortalecer la trama central. Cualquier dispersión hacia arriba contempla un requiebro innecesario en la película, una frivolidad en la película. Entonces, esa es la primer cosa, que son lenguajes antípodas.
Me encariñé con María Rojo, ¿no? La quise muchísimo. Yo adoraba lo que ella había hecho como personaje en una película de Hermosillo, que se llama María de mi corazón, con guión de Gabo. Me encanta lo que hizo en esa película. Me encanta ella como actriz, todo lo que ha hecho, pero de esa película era algo muy, muy poderoso. Entonces, escribiendo Danzón, desde el inicio, yo la tenía ella en mente. Yo nunca dejé de tener su imagen, su forma, su sonrisa, que es una sonrisa franca con unos dientotes grandotes que tiene. Su cosa como muy verdadera, de mujer verdadera, ¿no? Entonces, fue escrito para ella. Conforme escribíamos el guión, empecé a tomar clases de danzón con ella y a llevarla al salón de baile, al salón Colonia que todavía existía. Ahí tomábamos nuestras clases de baile. Ahí grababa yo a la gente bailando. Grabé con mi Handycam horas y horas y horas de gente bailando danzón. Fui entendiendo lo que era el danzón. Fui practicándolo, yo también bailaba mucho. Y se fortaleció mi amistad con ella. Y ella sabía que yo estaba escribiendo esa película para ella.
Un productor que conozco me dijo, no, que HBO va a hacer esta película basada en esta obra que se llama Real Women Have Curves, que si le interesa. Entonces él le dio mi nombre a uno de los productores y ellos me llamaron y me entrevistaron. Y ellos entrevistaron a varios directores entre HBO y los productores y me escogieron a mí. Entonces él también me dejó hacer cosas que nunca antes HBO había hecho. Por ejemplo, fue la primera película que se filmó en widescreen de HBO. Porque yo le hablaba mucho de la parte visual y yo había tomado fotos y con el cinematógrafo y entonces yo le mostraba las fotos y le decía, no, es que visualmente. Entonces él dijo, no, pues usted me está convenciendo que hagamos widescreen y ahora todo es widescreen. También me dejó poner español. Me dijo un día, no, porque inicialmente todo era en inglés y me dijo, no, pues si usted quiere, ponga español ahí. Y entonces, listo. Entonces, pues era una cosa que también fue mucho trabajo determinar qué es realista, ¿no? Dónde poner el español y en qué relación, y ahí lo pusimos. Entonces fueron muchas cosas que no había hecho HBO antes y luego eventualmente pues se convirtió en la primera película que distribuyeron para teatros en lugar de cable.
Okay. Hello, hello. Good afternoon, everybody. I love that. My name is Alex Rivera. I'm a filmmaker and occasional media artist, and I'm here to host this second conversation. I want to thank the Academy and the organizers of Pacific Standard Time for making this event possible and for inviting me to be a part of it. Okay, let's see here. Introductions. Okay, we're going to invite our panelists on stage. Rosalinda Fragoso, a film scholar and author who wrote the first book on Chicana and Chicano film culture. Any seat down there, wherever you want. Carlos Gutierrez, co-founder and director of Cinema Tropical, a New York-based nonprofit media arts organization that presents and promotes Latin American cinema. Carlos. And Laura Isabel Serna, associate professor in the Division of Cinema and Media Studies within the School of Cinematic Arts at the University of Southern California. Okay. Thank you all for joining us. Okay, so just I guess before we get started, I was just going to share a few just format kind of thoughts. So the panelists that are with us have written these extraordinary essays that are in the book that you'll all be receiving on your way out. And the essays were based on research that they did inside this archive, a new archive that Lourdes Portillo produced. We just saw some clips from some interviews from that oral history, right? So these the researchers here with me have been looking at that material and produced these essays that are in the book. And so if you're curious to learn more about what they're speaking about, it's all in that book. And because it is in the book, it gives us a little bit of the luxury we'll touch on what the essays explore, but we're also going to try to cover a lot of ground to talk about a set of concerns and questions around Latin American cinema, U.S. Latino cinema, and everything in between, if there's anything. So there'll be time for questions from the public after this conversation. So in about 40 minutes, we'll be opening the floor, and we'll also invite the previous group of writers onto stage with us. And so there'll be a chance for you to ask questions of this group as well as the previous group in about 40 minutes. And because we're on a schedule, I will be keeping track of time, so I might cut you guys off.
Yeah.
I don't want to, but I'll enjoy it if I have to. No, I'm just kidding. Anyways, just kidding. Okay, so we could start, I suppose, with Laura.
Oh,
Okay. And we'll just. Oh, okay. We can go the other way then.
Okay.
I'm here.
All right. Okay.
Okay, we'll go the other way. That's fine.
Okay. Are we going this way?
Yes.
All right. Okay. All right.
If that's an expectation,
all
why
right.
not?
Well, I first wanted to start out by thanking you for the introduction, Alex, and thanks to Randy Haberkamp, Ellen Harrington, and especially Lourdes Portillo for including me in this project. As the title of my essay, A Cinema of Her Own, makes evident, I mean, the topic is on the role of U.S. Latinas and Latin American women in cinema. And this topic grows out of a long-standing concern of mine with the exclusion of women, of Chicanas in the Chicano film movement, with Latinas and Latinos in Hollywood, not solely on screen, but behind the scenes in creative roles as cinematographers, directors, producers, writers, and so forth. I mean, the exclusion of Latinas and Latinos in Hollywood, as many of you know, is systemic. And so I want to commend the Academy for taking this positive step, right, in recognizing the richness and diversity of Latin American cinema, creating an archive that will be accessible globally. And I mean, it is a first step, because I think, as we could probably talk on this panel, there is a dearth of Latinas and Latinos, you know, within the archive. Recently, there's been a lot of criticism of the exclusionary practices of Hollywood, but this is not just a problem in this country. I mean, but also within the national film industries in Mexico, in Argentina, in Chile, in many other Latin American countries, in Central America as well. The underrepresentation, for instance, of indigenous and Afro-descendant voices on screen, but also behind the scenes. And so I sought to connect my chapter on women filmmakers with what Bill Nericho calls the visual apartheid in the industry, because I do believe that this has real implications in the political world. I mean, Latinas and Latinos are the most underrepresented racial group in Hollywood, in a film industry that's located in Los Angeles, where Latinos are half of the population. And so what does this tell us? We don't need to go to the U.S., to the San Diego, Tijuana, to see border wall. You know, there is a studio border wall right here in L.A., you know. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to discuss all of the major U.S. Latina and Latin American women filmmakers in the essay, mostly due to space limitations. I mean, you have 21 countries in Latin America and the U.S., and I had 15 to 20 pages to talk about them. So my focus of the essay is on the women who were interviewed by Lourdes Portillo as part of the Academy's Oral History project, and it's not an overview of U.S. Latinas or Latin American women filmmakers, because I wanted to write about their work in some depth, you know, because I was concerned with the question of whether or not it makes a difference who is behind the camera as director, as writer, as cinematographer, or with determining if the exclusion of women in the film industry, and not just on the screen, results in a different kind of cinema. That's a question that I posed to myself in the essay. And so based on the filmmakers that were interviewed by Lourdes Portillo, there is evidence to suggest, I'm not a social scientist, but I'll just say from what I saw, okay, that creating a film from a woman's perspective makes a phenomenal difference in how audiences see the world, in how we interpret reality, the kind of and quality of the stories that we see on screen. So what I do is I structure the essay into two parts. The first part is on women who helm films from a gender perspective, whose films reflect the diversity of women's stories, of women's voices, of women's culture, of women's issues, of women's experiences. And then the second part of the essay, I reflect on women in the industry
who work in creative behind the scenes roles as producers and screenwriters, but whose work is not really focused on women's stories. So kind of that's basically the gist of my essay.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Actually, my essay, well, first of all, but also join my fellow panelists in thanking the Academy for this wonderful opportunity. My essay book is a bookend, and in that sense, actually, what I try to do is like really to excite people. We're really in the midst of an amazing Latin American Renaissance that's been going on for 20 years now, but still really very underappreciated. Actually, it's been 20 years this November since Pizza, Birra y Faso, Pizza, Beer and Cigarettes by Adrián Caetano and Bruno Slainaro, kind of heralded what was called the new Argentinian cinema that enabled a younger generation of filmmakers to really kind of break up with the traditional narratives, doing more minimalistic stories, and also finding new ways to produce their low-budget films. That, along with the phenomenon of what I would call the global auteurs, the emergence of Amores Perros and its impact, Alejandro González Iñárritu in 2000, City of God from Brazil, Fernando Meireles, as well as Y Tu Mamá También, that created kind of a big momentum that kind of set the platform for what's been going on since then. What's been crazy is that, I've been working, Cinema Tropical kind of started around the same time. And many of my colleagues, we thought, maybe it's going to last 3-5 years. Because, in Latin American cinema, there's been a lot of ups and downs in terms of finances. But then we're 20 years later, and it's just incredible. Just to put some examples, and without taking too much time, even a country like not only like countries like Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, which, by the way, they're all breaking production records. Mexico has made 160 films last year, more than ever. But also countries that didn't have like a traditional film industry, like Costa Rica. In only 2 years, in 2014 and 15, they duplicated all of the films in the history, 20 films. And it's not only the numbers and also the box office locally, it's also, I think, the artistic freedom in different levels. There's been the filmmakers are really at the core. They find ways, really hybrid models of production that have enabled them to really push the envelope artistically. And I think that's a key element to all of this, both in the mainstream, independent, fiction, non-fiction, experimental. Another key element is also kind of the boundaries between traditional cinema and the visual arts. I think we're really in a key moment, and I think Latin America has a lot to teach to the world, because we're already, we're ahead. So a little, my essay talks about all of this, and also try to understand what's been happening, because again, it's been so vast and so big in different levels. Of course, in Hollywood as well. I mean, who would ever imagine that a Mexican national, and we had 2 Mexican nationals winning 3 years in a row the Oscar for Best Director. I mean, that changes the whole paradigm of how we were taught cinema, or how we were taught about our cinemas 20, 30, 40 years ago. But then again, also Hollywood is not only the pinnacle for, it's not at end to itself. Many filmmakers have decided to, they never consider even Hollywood as an option. For many filmmakers, I would say the majority, they're very happy they find ways to work locally. But then also there's a whole different transnational cinema going on, in the sense that a lot of Latin American filmmakers are actually not living in their places of origin, but then again creating work either back at home or in other countries, and that also including the US. So kind of in a nutshell, that's why my essay is about.
Wow. Fantastic, thank you.
So one of my key interests as a scholar, as a historian of cinema, is in exhibition and distribution, kind of the less sexy side of the equation. And my kind of first scholarly work really looked at that in the 1920s in Mexico, when American cinema dominated Mexican movie screens. And I came to, I really need to thank Alan for including me in this project, and Randy for such a beautiful set of programs, and Lourdes, who is an inspiration always. Okay, so to return to my thought. So what drew my attention in this project was to think about, so we've heard a lot about production and who's behind the camera, et cetera, to think about how those films circulate, right? And one of the most important circuits that Latin American and Latinx film travels on is the International and Domestic Film Festival circuit. It's an incredibly important kind of node in their lives as films. And I think that anyone that's paying any attention at all to the international film scene is struck by the fact that their international film festivals are incredibly important in bringing Latin American and Latinx film to the attention of a broader public. I think some of the films that you talked about, their very first introduction to a wide public was at an international festival. So it occurred to me that this was a really critical aspect of the kind of project and thinking about how these films circulate. And in the essay that I wrote, which like Rosalinda, my essay wanted to be a lot longer. It was really begging me to make it twice its length. I began by historicizing the presence of Latin American cinema in large international film festivals, initially in Venice and then at Cannes, right, in the 30s and the 40s. And I think that we know these kind of touchstones of Latin American film history where in the 1940s, for example, you know, Emilio El Indio Fernandez, the maybe or maybe not, I know the Academy says he's not the model for that. His film Maria Candelaria wins the Palme d'Or at Cannes in 1946, and Luis Buñuel, who is living and working in Mexico in the 1940s and 1950s, wins the Best Director Award in 1951 for Los Olvidados, and then continues to receive recognition for other films that he makes, as well as Brazilian directors, et cetera. And this kind of recognition at these very high-profile international film festivals was important, although it was sporadic, especially in the 40s and 50s. It was not a consistent thing. But generally, I think we can say that Latin American contributions to programs of these marquee festivals, which is how I think about them, Venice, Cannes, and Berlin, were overshadowed to a certain degree by quote-unquote art cinema from Europe and sometimes Asia. But that these really early experiences of recognition were really important for setting the stage for what would happen in the future in terms of Latin American cinema being recognized. I know we have heard already from our other panelists about new Latin American cinema, and that kind of movement in filmmaking also found welcoming audiences at European film festivals, although I don't think that that's necessarily the audience that those directors were trying to speak to kind of initially. But, you know, Black God, White Devil, I won't say it in Portuguese because my Portuguese is really bad, and Vidas Secas, both Brazilian films, right, about poverty and power, social power in northeastern Brazil, both screened in the official competition in Cannes in 1964, and both circulated in American independent film festivals that began to emerge in the 1960s. But even the most ardent film buffs, so I did a really deep dive because I'm an historian, so I got really into not just the archival material produced for this film, for this project, but also newspapers and the trade press, et cetera. I went to the Academy Library, the Margaret Herrick Library, and spent a long time there. But it's clear that there was limited exposure to Latin American films for certain audiences as kind of art films, and I think Carrie kind of gestured towards the Spanish language film circuit in which popular Latin American films circulated in this period. But in the 1970s and 1980s, this kind of weight distribution of Europe versus Latin America began to change. And that happened with the emergence of festivals oriented around what I'm going to call the Latinx experience as a shorthand. Chicano film festivals, Latino film festivals, in which not only are they showing the work of US-born Latinx filmmakers, but also retrospectives of Latin American cinema, new Latin American cinema, et cetera. And I think that those festivals in particular, and this is something I'm exploring in another essay that I'm writing, served as kind of points of encounter between Latin American filmmakers and US-born Latinx, in which people like myself, and were born in East LA, right, had the experience of seeing Latin American cinema for the first time, right, after having been raised on a diet of George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. So using the oral histories, I traced this history, and then I tried to come up with some kind of analysis of how festivals functioned for filmmakers and their films. And, I found that festivals really brought films to the attention of distributors and critics, and there were numerous occasions in the oral histories in which people talk about the importance of festival exposure for finding a wider audience for their work. They often, in very practical terms, someone was saying follow the money, I think that was also Carrie, but allowed filmmakers to secure funding to finish a film or to start a new one, and there were numerous examples as well of that being a really important mechanism, and I think that's grown even more today. And finally, Catherine mentioned Sundance, which grew out of the Sundance Film Festival, but the Institute at Sundance really being a mechanism for fostering independent film production, not only in the United States, but across the hemisphere, because they created models of workshops and mentoring that were replicated in other countries. So festivals perform all these important functions, and in the last part of the essay, kind of take up what maybe is the negative side of festivals being so critical to the circulation of Latin American and Latinx films, and that is that they also serve as kind of gatekeepers of film culture, right? Deciding which films are going to have the opportunity to be screened, sometimes even which films will ultimately get made, right? If they're providing finishing funds, et cetera. And even on a more theoretical level, having a strong hand in shaping categories like Latin American cinema, so instructing audiences in what Latin American cinema is, right, which may not actually be the totality of media that's being produced in other countries. And this is, there are a lot of reasons for this, which we can talk about. And there were several interviewees who talked about the sort of limits that festivals put as they sought kind of very particular sorts of films, right? The limits that they thought were being put on their kind of their creative process and ultimately the kind of films they wanted to make.
Great, well, wonderful. As I mentioned, we're going to cover a lot of ground, and ultimately we're going to take a dive kind of into what are the kind of mechanisms, the structures, the supports that have kind of enabled this this renaissance of filmic production in Latin America, and then we'll sort of try to come to understand a bit of how that's working, why that's happening, and then turn to maybe there's some lessons learned there that we could bring here in terms of supporting the development, because really we're starting kind of from zero of a U.S. Latino cinema. So we'll get there eventually, but first I just wanted to highlight, again, this question of the archive that's been created by Lourdes as part of this initiative, and ask the researchers kind of, in going into this new material, these new oral histories, was there anything that, when you were doing your research, that just surprised you? Anything that, just to kind of, because it's a public archive, to maybe entice people to get in there and explore a bit themselves, when you went in and started to hear these stories, was there something that kind of caught you off guard, or that was particularly tasty?
So do we start again this
Sure,
way?
anyway.
Okay. I think when Catherine mentioned Lupe Ontiveros, I think that brought to mind Patricia Cardoso's interview. And when she talked about trying to, she got hired for Lifetime to do a film. And she had the screenplay, and the screenplay had a male playing the doctor. And so she wanted to cast a woman, and she chose Lupe Ontiveros to do it. And the executives were like really upset. They said no, because not only does the screenplay call for a man to do it, but there's no Latina doctors, And she just kind of pushed back. I mean, and I was thinking to myself, because it's like when I grew up, and I'm talking about the 50s and the 60s, I remember Mexican-American doctors in South Texas that were women. And so I thought to myself, you know, this is the perception that the studio has of Latinas and Latinos. So that was one part. And the second part, I mean, let me just say the second part of Patricia's interview, where she talked about the vetting process that is so strenuous. In order, you know, she became, on 7 times, she was one of 2 people selected to do a major Hollywood film. And so the vetting process, you go through various kind of interviews, and the final interview of the 2 people that were finalists, her and, you know, another guy, you know, get interviewed by the president. And in all 7 times, he chose the white male director. And she, so there's like all these doors that are closed, you know. It's not that it was surprising, it was just to hear it from her in that interview that was like really kind of shocking. So when you say, why aren't there any Latina directors, you know, this is, you know, one of the answers for this as well. So that kind of hit me a lot.
And just one for folks that maybe are new to this conversation or just stepping into it, we're using the terms, you know, there's a question of language to describe these communities. And generally we try to use the term, I suppose, Latino to talk about folks that are kind of born, work, and struggle here, and Latin American for folks that are in, you know, all the countries south of the border. So there's, just in case people are not enmeshed in this conversation already. But okay, so Carlos, anything in the archive that jumped out at you?
Sure, and I have to say, in addition to being a pivotal filmmaker, Lourdes, she's an amazing interviewer. I mean, you know, for you to explore. I was going to say, in terms of the kind of the transnational and that kind of, I was struck in Alfonso Cuarón's interview. You know, he says that actually he has never lived in L.A. When he made Little Princess, he spent some time here, but he never officially moved to LA. And there's a wonderful quote from him. It's like, he says, "The noise of the factory doesn't let me sleep at night." So, you know, it's interesting that someone like Alfonso Cuarón, who lived in New York and I believe now in London, you know, has the impact that he has without having to be permanently, you know, in LA.
Well, I teach at USC in the School of Cinematic Arts, so a lot of my students are undergrads who want to be filmmakers. This is their dream, kind of across the board. Some of them want to be editors because they're kind of smart. I think. I'm like, there's all these other jobs that people have in the film industry. But one of the things that struck me, and I'm excited that these materials are available for the public to use, is that I want my students to read about how long people work before they get their big break. Mm-hmm. The student film that they make with Becca here or fellowship here and some money that you borrow from someone here, et cetera, and the kind of process that goes into that. Since I'm not a filmmaker, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. That's kind of their very frank discussion of times when they thought, I'll never be able to finish this film because I don't have any money, and it's just a project that's sitting around, but I think it was especially exciting for me to contemplate having my students read these firsthand accounts of what it's like, because they all think they're going to graduate and someone's going to give them the director's chair, and it's kind of a nice dose of reality, right? So I really appreciated that in the archive.
Wow. Yeah. The 3 comments together, whether it's hearing the stories of struggle and rejection by the studio system, or Alfonso Cuarón's advice, you don't need to live here, or that it's going to be terribly difficult. It's basically, it sounds now, if I'm ever feeling too good, I guess I'll take a dive into the too optimistic. No, it sounds it's reality. I suppose what you're going to get inside this archive is something real, and that's ultimately incredibly valuable, and especially deep exploration of these experiences from this community at this time. you know, it's super important, and I can't wait to take a look myself. So now pivoting a bit towards Latin America and this question of this kind of renaissance. And Carlos, I thought the way you described it was fantastic, just from your friends and your community's point of view of thinking, wow, this is a kind of a moment this year. Let's do something. Let's create an organization to give it a push this year, or maybe next year it'll continue. And here we are 20 years later, and it's still going. So could you speak just, I mean, maybe take one or two countries and speak about the systems. What changed, or what pieces of the puzzle moved to start this film production renaissance happening? And sort of maybe, if it helps, perhaps you could start with anything in the kind of public system in terms of governments, what they were doing, and then also speak about the sort of market and anything that changed there. But the way we'll do it is maybe production, distribution, and then analysis of what isn't happening and what isn't working. So I think that's maybe how we'll go.
Sure. I mean, I guess we also have to contextualize what's been happening in Latin America the past 15, 20 years. Particularly because I think this renaissance is a product of kind of the emergence of a big civil society. It's not the government's coming in and saying, "Oh, there's this money." No, it's a struggle. You know, after Latin America had most of the countries had a very difficult time in the 80s and through the early 90s. We saw a different kind of a political reemergence in Latin America, which kind of reflected in the political in the governments. But I think it was, you know, it's a very interesting period what's been happening. Of course, now we're going through another change of era. Let's see you know, where that leads to. But I think the cinema has been a reflection of that. But I think what it's key is like the growth of a civil society. So in that sense, filmmakers have been taking the camera as a way to really push the envelopes, to try topics and try to issues that they were not explored before. And what has allowed for that is, I think, the hybrid model of productions. Trying to find monies from different sources, but at the same time, keeping the artistic freedom. So, of course, there's some government support. There's a lot of tax breaks, very interesting tax breaks that have allowed companies to invest in cinema directly instead of paying taxes. That has a major impact in Mexico and Brazil, for example. Another key element has been international co-productions. Like countries like Guatemala that doesn't have a strong support. You know, the Guatemalan filmmakers have been able to get funds from other parts of it.
And were those tax breaks new initiatives that kind of timed out with this renaissance, or had they been long-standing?
You know what? Actually, the new Argentinian cinema, it's tied to a very innovative film law in 1994. And actually, afterwards, a lot of countries have followed through, and they have added new things. Brazil, Mexico, Colombia. I think probably Colombia has one of the most interesting models because they really learn from the other countries. So it's a very dynamic that allows for different types of production. And again, and diversity, I think, is also important here. And I try to avoid the word, talking about Latin American cinema because it's very reductionist. Even with countries, even within countries, I think we need to talk about Mexican cinemas in plural, or Argentinian cinemas, Brazilian cinemas, because you can't. There's such a diversity of production that that one size doesn't fit all. That's, I think, also very important. And the third part, and I finish with this. I remember, Alex, we were in a panel once, and you said we need to claim the right of failure, and I think that's what's happened in Latin America. That a filmmaker that their films doesn't get screened or shown, and that's a case. I mean, distribution and exhibition, it's a worldwide problem, but that doesn't
curse you and banish you from working for the rest of your life.
You know, we have a lot of 30-year-old filmmakers making 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th films. There's a whole continued process that's separated from production, from distribution and exhibition, which I think is also key. Separating production from distribution and exhibition till we don't solve the issue of distribution and exhibition.
So in terms of like the essence of these some systemic changes that occurred in a few Latin American countries that enable this, new tax incentives, changes in civil society in terms of new investment capital coming to the table, those kind of bullet points of what is the underpinning, let's say just in the case of Mexico, what enabled this new kind of golden age or platinum age perhaps to emerge? Would those be some of the bullet points? Or?
Yeah, totally. And the combination of diversity of funds and again, artistic freedom. That happens both in the mainstream, because also, I mean, I personally think cinema is just, it's in three obsolete dichotomies, like that false division between arts, film as art and commerce is completely outdated. And in that sense, I think a lot of films in the mainstream, in Argentina and Mexico, are very potent and very political at the same time, but because they're made in that form of production, they're not validated as such, So what we have, I think it's an impressive body of work, like a really vast generation of filmmakers, and we're just trying to make sense, because still even though Latin America, again, has become an epicenter of international cinema, still so underrepresented in film festival circuit, and we're still kind of trying to make sense of what's been going on.
And Laura, in terms of, one of the things Carlos is describing is a kind of non-centering towards Hollywood. Like the filmmakers in Latin America are looking at all other stuff, a diversity of systems and a diversity of strategies, and someone navigating around Hollywood and finding success to do it. Even folks like Cuarón, incredibly, right? So within the world of festivals and distribution, is that also occurring outside of this kind of marquee? We all know, like, if you're, for whatever reason, you get your movie into Cannes or Sundance, you're going to have an international community looking at it for a moment in time. Within Latin America, is there other kind of systems for getting films out, sidestepping around those marquee festivals, or has that been part of the strategy, or has it been more produce in these sidebar systems, alternate systems, and then go through the front door in terms of the marquee festival?
Well, I think one of the ironic things, maybe about speaking specifically about Latin American cinema, and I'm going to kind of refer to Mexico because that's the case I know the best, is that oftentimes international film festivals open the domestic market for them as well. Mm-hmm. And I think Carlos will agree with me, right? That when a film is recognized, has this kind of imprimatur of the critics and the buzz in festivals, then it can be shown on multiple domestic screens, because I spent a long, hot summer in Mexico City in which the only thing I could see at a regular movie theater, except for the Cineteca, was Batman Returns, I feel like. It was showing on multiple screens in every theater, et cetera. And that is still the case, that many Latin American kind of commercial exhibition venues show American films. This is not just the case in Latin America, it's the case in lots of other countries as well. And have a vision of going with a friend to see a Mexican movie, and we said, and she said, vamos a hacer patria. So we're going to go be good citizens. It's probably not going to be very good, et cetera. And I think that really has changed in the last 20 years, definitely. And I think that there is this irony, and this started with Buñuel, right? Los Olvidados. The critics hated it. It was horrible. It won a prize. They were like, "Oh, he's our favorite guy. We love him, and that movie's so incredible." So I think that there's a bit of an irony there, in that sometimes local venues, although they're micro cinemas. I mean, if we're going to study the kind of ecology of exhibition, there are places, and Latin America has a very robust film culture comprised of cineclubs, right, which could be anything from like the faculty of psychiatry at a university that have a monthly cinema show screening, to micro cinemas, to local institutions like the Cineteca that dedicate a great deal of their programming to films that are maybe produced in these alternate kind of paths, et cetera. I think that still is very vibrant today. So those are other places where these films can find an audience.
Thank you. And Rosalinda, I was really happy in your comments that you mentioned the challenges within these countries. Obviously, to Carlos's point, these are all giant countries, and our countries of various sizes, but some of them are massive countries in Latin America, and to kind of generalize about them really erases a lot of history within those countries. And so I was really happy that you brought up the ongoing struggle to have an indigenous presence in Mexican cinema. You know, there was an announcement in Variety, I think 5 years ago, that Cananá, Gael and Diego's company was going to produce the first indigenous written and directed feature film in Mexican history. And I know the filmmaker, and the film has still not been produced, which is incredible. In 2017, there still hasn't been an indigenous-helmed feature film within Mexico, a country that has vast indigenous populations to this day. So could you talk a little bit about, like, what, despite the fact that there is a renaissance, what are some of the challenges within inherent to this project? And
yeah, I mean, I think it's not only Mexico. I mean, Lucrecia Martel talks about, who is from the north, you know, western part of Argentina, Salta, you know, and she talks about, like, kind of the dirt, all this rich, you know, diversity in terms of indigenous groups, but also kind of the dearth in the country of recognizing, you know, the importance of, you know, these voices, you know, in film and in culture in general, and in Mexico too. And I think, you know, there's, I mean, all of these various groups of indigenous people in Mexico. Like I have a student of mine who is studying filmmakers in Oaxaca, but you know, it's not Oaxaca's a state, right? But she's looking at Zapotec and Mixtec filmmakers, and they have their own collectives, you know, so they're not part of, you know, like the national film schools, or not in, you know, the, you know, kind of national industries, but they're really kind of working at the local level where there's kind of community support. So in terms of kind of these micro spaces, you know, there's micro spaces, you know, all over Latin America. You have all of these different indigenous and Afro-descendant groups as well. You know, we hardly talk about, we talk about the indigenous in Latin America, but we don't talk about, you know, the Afro-descendant groups who are also, you know, in so many countries in Latin America. I mean, we think about them mostly in Brazil, but they're in Colombia, they're in, you know, Argentina, they're in Chile, they're in all these other places. So I think that, you know, there is a kind of a renaissance in terms of that work, but there's not necessarily been the funding structures to get this work in, you know, kind of broader, in kind of the broader screen, or, you know, kind of in international venues and so forth. So I think, you know, people that are doing the kind of research or doing the kind of exposure are really, you know, well, people are beginning to focus on the kind of, you know, independent works that are going on. And so that's why I do agree that the concept of Latin American cinema is really kind of problematic, because it sort of homogenizes this incredible kind of diversity. You're really talking about, you know, 20 countries, and within those countries, more nations, you know, that are comprised of indigenous and, you know, Afro-descendant, and even Asian, you know, Latino as well, you know, so in Mexico and in Peru and in other places, you know, so.
And so with that, I guess, I was speaking with Lourdes before this panel, and we were talking about the Renaissance in Latin American film, and then talking about the kind of counterpoint in terms of what's happening here. You know, I have a daughter, and I think statistically, and I'm not saying this to be sarcastic or glib, but I actually think statistically the odds of her becoming a filmmaker in today's marketplace and getting a film as a young Latina, to get a film in a theater, are actually lower than her being hit by lightning. There's literally, out of 50 million US Latinos, 50 million of us here, 50 million at least. I believe there was less than, if there were 3 US Latino film productions last year that made it to a theater, I think I'd be overcounting. It's literally, I think Rosalinda was saying, a study said there were 0.
Yeah, the study at USC on the underrepresentation of you know, racial women and racial groups within 900 popular films that did not. I mean, I read the study, and there was like 2 Asian directors and The rest were white males.
And that was quantifying.
And African American, and then the rest were white males.
And that's quantifying studio films. So it's in terms of what are we looking at. There's obviously a lot of visual production from our communities, but in terms of getting through the kind of studio system or getting a movie that hits the theater, these numbers are, you count them on one hand in terms of out of 50 million people in this country, those who've gotten the shot to get into a movie theater. It's an incredible quandary, that we'd have a better chance of being hit by lightning than making a movie. But Lourdes was saying if there's a renaissance in Latin America, there's a retrosance here in the U.S. And I thought, that word, I'm going to take it with me because I think it's a winner. So we're going through a retrosance. And how do we end it? Is there anything we can learn? And I would say just to end on a kind of hopeful note, just kind of imagining if there was a sympathetic administration that said, what do you want from a federal government to resolve this crisis, because we value the voices of our Latino citizens and we want to know their stories. If there was that, what would it be that would help? Or if the studio said, we want to address this, what would it be? Because whatever we've been trying for the past several decades, because this isn't a new issue, it's an old issue. A lot of people in this room have been talking about it for decades. I'm one of them. And it's not getting better. It's getting worse. So in the spirit of not being crazy, people want to do the same thing over and over again and get a different result. What could we do differently? What isn't being done? Just ideas.
I think Carlos mentioned it, and I think Lucrecia Martel in her interview as well talked about it. It was when, Argentinian crisis happened. People went and did co-productions, and I think that that's one possibility of doing co-productions. And I'm talking about with other countries, co-productions, between Spain and U.S. Latinos, or between U.S. Latinos and Mexico, or between whatever industries in Latin America have that availability. And so I think that that's one option. One thing that you said, this has been going on historically for a long time. This has been going on, since the 60s or even before. And I think that, we've tried boycotts, we've tried all kinds of things. We've tried, petitioning the industry. And so we might have to go, outside and do transnational, kind of local productions. That's, one possibility.
I also have to say, we also have to set the platform, because there's also filmmakers out there. I'm just thinking right now, I don't know, like Michelle Stephenson, with her documentary American Promise. She's Haitian, Panamanian, Canadian, American. That's a lot of thing. A lot of when you call yourself Latino, it's a lot of mixtures. But but like she has been able to make a career in the nonfiction realm. So there's people there, but we have to also kind of make a census and really connect the dots, because there's more dots to be connected than we think in this country as well. And secondly, open up. How can we learn in this country what's happened in other parts of Latin America that, again, they didn't have tradition, like Costa Rica or Guatemala are good examples. How they managed to foster a new generation of filmmakers that can continue to make films, and that's key. How do we give the possibility of filmmakers to have a film career? And I think that's key. Filmmakers to make 1, 2, 3, 4 films, to continue making a career independently to what happens to those films. Of course, that's important, but I think the key first is to allow to have you should be filmmaking more often, Alex, for example.
Thanks. It's all. Yeah, we were about to end this.
Okay,
this
that's
chapter,
okay. I'm kind of feeling cynical these days, so it's hard for me to enter into your world of kind of this fantasy. Although I will say that from looking at these interviews, it was clear that there were programs that were supported that really made work like El Norte, like these really important Chicanx films, Latinx films possible in the 80s and the 90s. And that seems to have fallen out of fashion somewhat. So if we were asking for programmatic funding, I think that would be, because filmmaking is an expensive endeavor, regardless of whether you're making nonfiction films or, and collectives that pool their resources, maybe that's another, this is, Rosalinda is talking about transnational collaboration, but maybe there's kind of collective resource pooling that could also be really interesting.
Yeah. Well, man, I really want to share my ideas, but we've run out of time. But one thing I will say, just real quick, is that just to add a splash of paint on the board, is that there is a history to doing this kind of thing in this country. ITVS, maybe people in the room know what ITVS is, the independent television service based in San Francisco, a budget of I think about $15 million a year. They mostly support documentary. Where did it come from? It's public money. It's government money that supports it. It came from independent filmmakers lobbying. It was three guys named, what were their names? Does anyone, Lawrence, do you know the guy that owns California Newsreel? Anyways, I think they were all named Scott. It was something like that. But all three of them had the same name. They all had the same name. They were representing the Association of Independent Video and Filmmakers, and which is an organization of filmmakers. And they went to DC and they lobbied. And they said, we need to have funding to create educational independent films. And they got a little tiny line item of $15 million. Today, it's one of the best games in town for documentary filmmakers, but we forget that it came from filmmakers saying we can change things. And we have a crisis right now in this country where buildings are being destroyed and falling down in Mexico City, Puerto Rico is being destroyed, and our politicians want to build a wall with no roof, just a wall. There's a deep sickness in this country, in my opinion. Part of it is the lack of our stories being told. It's a backdrop that allows that kind of sickness to grow. We need our stories to be told. And if we can't imagine a way to change this situation, if we can even say it, if we can imagine it, it's not going to change. Our numbers are not going to change it. 50 million people is enough to deserve the change. We can't reproduce our way out of this one. So with that, I would invite the rest of the panelists back onto the stage. Catherine, Carrie, Jose, come on up, and then let's face the public.
Should we stand?
Thank you.
You want us to stand up and? Oh, okay, there you are. Oh, okay. Oh, that's fine.
Okay. Hey, Catherine. 55 million Latinos, so, and one of them is mine, so. But maybe when we get to 60, we get to make films. Okay, so I hope folks are out there thinking about questions or comments. And I believe we've got a microphone at the front of each aisle. And so please step right up. Step right up. And hey.
Good afternoon. First of all, again, I want to thank the Academy. I want to thank all the panelists, my friend Jimmy. Alex, I don't know you, but hello, I'm Minerva. I'm coming with this comment from a very pissed off, very pissed off feeling. As a woman in the industry, as a woman of color, Rosalinda's comment of us being erased completely. I mean, and it's not just, Latinas, it's African Americans, it's, more white women are represented, but I really want to get to the root of the frickin' problem. Why are we erased? As women, older women, and also, I include our fellow Latino filmmakers. We are erased. It's like, who the hell gave you birth? Who the hell raised you? And then why do you go and make your film with 20 men and 1 woman? So I want to know from filmmakers, why? Why do you do this? Why do you erase your mothers, your sisters, your daughters? I want to know. And how the F do we freaking finally break that?
Well, I would say, again, women are obviously a majority and always have been. So when we talk about getting minorities into film, et cetera, women are a majority and have been represented, I think, in numbers around 5%, 6% within the ranks of studio directors. And so again, this is not a question about like these are new communities that are trying to work their way into a system. The majorities, like women, have been excluded historically to this day. And so there's something very grave going on that numbers and demographics aren't going to change. It looks like Catherine might have some ideas about what will change it.
Well, I actually think that's where Latin America can be very instructive. Because if you look at women's participation in Latin American film industries, it's been there for a long time. And in fact, they have sort of jump-started a lot of new waves of filmmaking, right? The whole retomada in Brazil in the 90s, there were a lot of women filmmakers. So I think there's a different sense of how to build, right, collaboration in a filmmaking project than there is here. And I think maybe Rosalinda wants to follow up from this, but I just wanted to say that this is one of the areas where Latin America has a lot to teach the U.S.
Sorry, and one thing to put on the table, just in terms of when we talk about these numbers, maybe if it is worth distinguishing between documentary and fiction, because in this country I know that women, I think, over-index in the production of documentaries and then are nearly absent in the production of sort of studio feature film.
Well, again, documentaries, the budgets are lower. It was almost a stealth takeover, but because when nobody cared.
Well,
now, the only little stat I like to throw in is from 1925, but up until 1925, half of all films were written by women, i.e., when people didn't care about the business, women were thriving.
And Rosalinda.
You're talking about women of color, though. That's your question, though, in particular. And are you talking about in studio films or just in film in general? In general, yeah. I mean, I'm not so sure. I mean, the women in the Oral History Project and also other, women filmmakers that, I've researched and all, they're not necessarily that celebratory. I mean, Maria Novarro talks about, the fact that, her film, Sin Dejar Huella, which is a road film about women, played like for a week, and how she was attacked when she made the film Danzón by the Mexican male critics, and because, for the topic of the film. And, so I'm not necessarily, that's celebratory about, women's participation. I think there are many women filmmakers in Latin America, but I also think that there's a dearth and there has been a marginalization as well. And in this country as well, in the Chicano film movement, I mean, I wrote about that, and there was an exclusionary practices of women from the Chicano film movement as well. Many of the filmmakers that we will see who are very prominent filmmakers, but they weren't inclusive of women filmmakers. So there has been a problem for a very long time, and I'm not sure. The solution is, of course, holding accountability and holding these filmmakers accountable for those exclusionary practices.
And may I? Yeah. And I would just name those exclusionary practices sexism.
Yeah.
Right? Let's call it what it is.
Yeah.
And I would say, although women were writers, Carrie, there are really not that many well-known female directors. But my colleague, Mark Garrett Cooper, has this really interesting book about, it's called Universal Women. And it's about this moment in the teens when there were a handful of not just women directors, but kind of really famous and powerful women directors like Lois Weber, who had complete creative control, who could bank a film, et cetera. And the argument that he makes in this book, and this is getting around to how do we change this, is that this had to do with an institution. So institutions have ideas about gender, right? And part of his thesis in the book is that at a certain point, the labor of directing became a job that was a job for men. Whereas at the moment when these women were really active and receiving a lot of support from the studios, that job was not exactly genderless, but it was more flexible. right? So in some ways, it's about changing the culture, right, in which women are not seen as kind of either relegated to certain kinds of work in the industry, which I know happens because I talk to my students and I know that they get kind of pushed into very particular career paths that where people hire, like editors, they hire a lot of women, et cetera, but also changing the kind of norms of gender in an institution. You can think of filmmaking kind of writ large as an institution with lots of sub-institutions in it, but really changing ideas about how that, and that I think is a process of education, because once people can see, and that's not an easy answer, I'm not trying to punt on that question, but once people see that as systemic and not coincidental, then, and I think this accountability kind of piece is, yeah.
No, I also think collaboration, the spirit of collaboration is very important. And I think that's what the women who were working in Mexico and Colombia in the 80s had in mind, right? That you sort of can collectively produce works, that you have a sort of flexible definition of what directing means, of what cinematography means, of what writing means. And I think, we see this to be easier in the case of documentary. It's harder in the case of fiction, where the notion of authorship sort of begins to kick in. But I think collaboration is very important.
Wonderful, and I'm so sorry. If it's okay, maybe we weave some of this into the remaining conversations. We don't have. I'm so sorry. What? I feel bad. Go ahead.
No, one final thing is, like, Maria Novarro talks about the fact that she left the union in Mexico, the sindicato, because a woman couldn't touch a camera, and she wanted to have a cinematographer who was a woman, so she just formed collectives, so, I mean, this is like, anyway, just goes on and on. I'm sorry.
One thing I was going to say is, I know this isn't formally a panel about advocacy, and it's a panel about Latin America and Los Angeles, but obviously when we started to look at this side of that, on this side of the looking glass, we have to go into this terrain, because unfortunately we can't have a robust conversation about the myriad of U.S. Latino cinematic production. Even though, that being said, there certainly is. And tonight on the Latinos panel, we're going to hear from some dynamic and groundbreaking and vicious Latina filmmakers. Say it because they're my friends. Looking forward to hearing from them tonight.
Somebody used the expression Latinx films. Is that a new cultural category? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Okay. Spanish is gendered, right, as a language. I mean, when we speak about nouns. And so when you refer to male directors or Latino directors, or women directors to be Latina directors. And so this was an idea of sort of not creating that kind of gender boundary sort of from the get-go, but rather to allow for some kind of flexibility there. So the X means to be determined, or however one wishes to define it. And I think that then got extended to Chicano and Chicana, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm a writer-director currently attending film school. I'll be graduating very soon, and I was hearing, finally, the word I was looking for was collaboration, because filmmaking is a collaborative environment. But what I keep hearing is how you're looking to possibly and recommend co-productions with US-based Chicano or Latino filmmakers who go to another country and do collaborations, but I haven't heard anything about possibly collaborating with our African-American brothers and sisters and some of the production companies. For example, Ava DuVernay, with her show Queen Sugar, she's hired all women directors, and I believe 2 of them were Latinas this last season. Not only that, but one of the less celebrated and I believe totally snubbed of episodes within Queen Sugar actually had a segment with farm workers out in the South, and it was completely done bilingually and in Spanish, and was better done than some of the Latino shows on TV. So going back to that, we keep saying, let's go back to Latin America, let's go back to Spain, let's collaborate, let's do blah, 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 but we have African American brothers and sisters, and especially when we live in LA, and if we're from LA, we don't live in a silo, especially if we're not from East LA, like I'm not. So I grew up around people that were of different nationalities. So it's more realistic for me to say I'm going to collaborate with another person of color than saying I'm going to collaborate with another Latino.
Great. Well, does anyone want? I love. To me, that's a guide in my own personal life, and I find it inspiring. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about that, or also I think it's also looming a little bit. Has there been much of a practice, given this renaissance and these kind of titans of cinema coming out of Latin America, of them entering this U.S. Latino space and offering opportunity, mentorship, solidarity? Does that exchange exist much? I honestly don't. I'm asking because I don't know.
There's a younger generation of filmmakers. I'm thinking Rodrigo Reyes. He's based. Well, he finally moved to. He moved to Oakland recently, but he was based in Modesto, I believe. And he was working as a translator in the court. He's found some funds to make his films in Mexico, actually, because originally he tried here, but he was not getting funding. So he met a producer in Mexico, and they found a way to produce his work. And now he's going through his third film, and he's not even 30, I believe. So I think we're still seeing more, younger generation kind of opening those doors. We need more of that, and us working as those connectors. But also, I agree. I mean, and again, there's no really one formula. We need to open up to allow different kinds of productions to coexist. I think that's also key.
I think mentoring is essential. I mean, finding a mentor. I think the industry is really open to give their time and talk to students, and they're very helpful. I mean, having a mentor at any stage of your life is very important.
I just want to think, I said with the comment that the woman made was just so important, and I think we do need to reach out to other communities of color, and I think that's really a brilliant idea, and I think I'm glad that she raised it, and it's important for filmmakers to do that, so I wanted to applaud her.
Yeah, thank you for that comment.
And
can I just briefly say that I think there are some historical models for just the kind of collaboration that between communities of color. For example, William Greaves, who's best known as an experimental documentarian and a master of the kind of African-American documentary film, also made this series of films for the EEOC in the early 1970s, in which he collaborated with Jose Garcia, who was a Puerto Rican filmmaker from New York, and they worked together on these films that were they're sponsored films, so they have kind of educational purpose and stuff. But I think it's beneficial for us to be mindful of precedents, right, for just precisely the kind of collaboration that you're talking about. And that happened because they were working in the same kind of milieu in New York, both Jose Garcia and William Greaves. And so they knew each other. And so Bill Greaves said, hey, I need you to help me write for this film. And then he had another Puerto Rican do the sound for the film. And the film stars Anthony Quinn and Rita Moreno. But I think it's really interesting to think back historically on how that kind of collaboration is produced, right, in what kind of institutions and contexts.
And one of the filmmakers, I think you might be referring to Aurora Guerrero, who she is a Chicana filmmaker who worked with Ava DuVernay's company on Queen Sugar, embodying that kind of solidarity and that kind of possibility. She'll be here tonight, so she's a badass. Okay.
Thank you. Oh, yeah.
I'm so sorry. I don't know who's. Thank you.
Hi, how are you? My name is Jose. I'm Chinese and I'm from Venezuela. I just want to say thank you for coming here and sharing your experiences. I didn't think I could be an actor back in Venezuela. And after coming here for college, I think, it can happen. So I just want to ask you, maybe one of you, each one can give me just maybe a suggestion for all the young people are here in America, what they can do to help make that change in the Latino or Asian or anything, to push the film industry, like to make that change. So it was like that, maybe sharing that article on Facebook, or maybe that trailer that your friend from Chile made here in the US. So maybe just that little suggestions that you might have for young people.
Well, it sounds like you have some ideas already, so those are good to share. I'm not sure we have time for everybody, but anybody have something to offer?
If you want something, be persistent.
Be persistent. Yeah.
Try to transform certain situations into opportunities, such as internships, right? If you were studying film or you're studying acting, sometimes you're able to intern, and that can lead to something else. And I think, I know one of the oral histories reveals how important that was to an actor's career. And so even if you are not officially part of something, any kind of participation really helps, and then to take that as a platform to sort of move forward.
And watch films. The films of the filmmakers should be basic curricula. So start from there. Also, I think it's important to also, learn from the past filmmakers. I think watching films is very important.
Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to add to that. I know you're not asking me, but I'm actually a trailer editor for Universal, which I never thought I would come out to LA to become. And one of the things that I would say is also look for the gaps where there's industries and positions where there's nobody like you, because your perspective will totally be appreciated. Well, God willing. But I also just wanted to comment to Rosalinda, as somebody who's kind of in the belly of the beast in the studio. I completely agree with you saying that even the concept of Latin American film is kind of a reductionist thing, because I know whenever I have to cut a Hispanic spot, my question is okay, so we're doing a spot for Miami and Chicago and LA. Are you mad? Yeah, I just wanted to say I appreciate you saying that, because I'm in marketing and I kind of don't understand it, and I really wish my industry would catch up. And just kind of as a Chicano, one of the things that I've been looking at is all of my heroes in the 80s and the 90s, the Cheeches, the Louis, the Robert Rodriguez's, and just seeing, roughly in the aughts, how a lot of that disappeared. Even LA Stories, Real Women Have Curves, was a Latin American national. Lowriders, Latin American national. And, thank God for the Auroras. Thank God for you, Alex. My Sleep Dealer's dope. Yeah.
Oh my God.
But my question is, what happened from the age of El Mariachi to now, when you can have a little cute indie Sundance movie and get a $150 million franchise movie, unless your last name ends in a Z. So I wanted to kind of get some of your perspectives on that.
Thank you so much, man. Thank you for that. Does anyone have any ideas in terms of what changed? Is that analysis, like from a sort of scholarly point of view, right, that there was maybe more production in the 90s within the U.S. Latino world than there is today? Is that numerically accurate for folks that are in this?
Within the industry?
Yeah, within the industry.
I think so, and I think a lot of it has to do with the social movements. But I think we might see a shift in that, because I think with this president and with the cutbacks in public funding that he and his administration are proposing, with the kind of white supremacy that we see that's just become unleashed in this country, I think we're going to see the beginning of social movements, and perhaps that will be a change as well, an opening. I think this is a good opening. I think we need to go further than I'm talking about. This LA project is fantastic, but I think we need to go further than that, and I think you're going to begin to see a lot more, coalitional work and a lot more pressure on institutional racism in this country, and it includes the studios as well. So we can't, think about that they're exempt from what's happening in the broader context. So I'm hoping that that will push it in another direction.
Sorry.
I mean, I'm not sure if anybody else has anything.
I want to hear from more folks from the public. I would just say, there's another panel, maybe in some other reality, where we could talk from where I would share my story with maybe some of my colleagues who made a first film and got to Sundance and won awards, and it's myself, Aurora, Cruz Angeles. There's a kind of, I would call us almost a lost generation, man. I mean, we did get a shot, and it's been 10 years for me. I haven't made a second film. I'm about to, but it's been, anyways, there's a story there, and it's not me. It's a story of a generation.
Yeah.
And we could parse that another time. But I guess to my friend here.
Hello. I am Scott. I'm a college professor. I was so excited about this event, I brought my entire freshman class.
Awesome. Yay. Hi.
Raise your hands,
Hi,
guys. Raise your hands.
Oh, my God.
But there's a question. So I was waiting, I counted. I have 8 men and 8 women. I have all different races represented. These guys are going to inherit this industry. What would you like to say to these people who soon are going to take over this whole thing?
Thank you.
Be in charge of all of this.
That's what I'd like to say.
What would you like to say? Emerging, 5 and 10 years from now.
Continue making what you love.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Continue making what you love, and keep focusing on what the things that you need to express with your creativity.
Share your culture.
I think also it's time to be idealistic again. We need to future better worlds that we have. And that's, I think, the problem, that there's no alternative right now. So it's really on you to really imagine new possible future worlds. And, we need a lot of activism, but I think we also need a lot of, go back to the idealism of the 60s. And we need to think about better futures and better worlds that we can have.
And watch films from all different cultures, from other parts of the world.
See, Lourdes Portillo's interview, and I think Maria Novarro, also talk about the importance of telling your story and of being persistent in telling your story. We need to hear those stories, yeah.
And the other thing I would say is that technology is not just magic, that there are a lot of different approaches, and I think that some of the strength of the cinema that is represented in the series is that people also thought of artisanal ways to make films. And so your engagement with that technology is very important too. You can make it work in certain ways that maybe other people haven't. So try to explore those ways as well.
And remember, technology is just a tool. What matters is what's in your mind, because that's where the ideas come from.
Thank you very much.
And I would just say, if for the folks that are within the Latino sphere, if you're looking for Latino films here and you're not seeing them and you feel depressed, look at other art forms. Look at our literature. Look at theater. In this century, some of the greatest works of literature, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde by Junot Diaz, Hamilton by Lin-Manuel Miranda, are the luminous, dominant works in those mediums. And we can absolutely have a cinema that hits at that level. There's no reason we can't. So I'd say, take in a lot of artwork made by people who lived what you've lived, because it's out there in other forms. It's not with us yet in the cinema, but it can be. And thank you so much for your.
We have time for one more question.
Oh boy, can we just let everyone in the public say their thing, and then maybe we'll talk about it informally outside? Is that okay? We just run the questions with no answers, and we'll speak outside.
Like life.
How about this? Let's run the questions and then just get a splash of quick answers. But let's hear from everybody. There's some young folks. I want to hear what they have to say.
So I know that there's been a lot of press about the success of Latin America, like telenovelas and television. And I know that you're all focused on cinema, so you might not know, but I'm wondering if there's some collaboration that could happen between the cinema and the television industry, and whether that could be a road to success. And sort of as a second part to that question, I know that some of the success has come from selling of formats. So there's been a telenovela that's been successful, and then that's sold as a format, and then it's reproduced in the United States or elsewhere, but maybe not with the same directors or actresses or actors, or in sort of a Western style. And I'm wondering if that is seen beneficially as like bringing money into the system, or whether that's seen as harmful or hurtful.
I didn't know what selling a format was until about 3 months ago. I'm not sure. Thank you for the question. We'll get at it. And
so really quickly, I'm going at you from like a writer's perspective. Since you guys are filmmakers and scholars and consumers of film and media, what are some motifs or some character arcs or something in Latino stories that kind of stand out and stuff that needs to be not recreated but maybe hit again, or something that can help these Latino stories kind of come back into like the mainstream?
So the question of formats and work from Latin America kind of reproduced here. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, Jane the Virgin is one such case.
Ugly Betty.
Ugly Betty.
Ugly Betty. It's okay. So so maybe just I suppose does anyone want to comment on what that does culturally and within the industry?
Well, actually, I'm a little bit skeptical of that, because I think basically you're buying a format, and what that is, what kind of substance that has, will change in a different context. Ugly Betty's character and what she was able to achieve definitely changed in the U.S. context as compared to the Mexican and Colombian context. What I think is interesting is the question of TV and film. One of the things that comes out in the oral histories is that a lot of filmmakers got their first opportunity in television. Some publicly funded, such as American Playhouse. Others directing episodes. And so I think that is to be open to that, as a possibility, and to try to learn from that, I think is really important. I think formats are just an easy way to just keep regenerating, breathing energy into an industry. I think it's much more important in terms of how you cast a program, where the setting is, whether there's a sense of place in the program, and how you deal with language and that sort of thing.
Thank you. And Rosalinda.
The final thing, quickly, I had a wonderful conversation with Aurora Guerrero, and she said some of the most exciting things for Latinas and Latinos is happening in television. So I think we shouldn't, the question is important, but it's also important in this country as well,
And anyone want to touch this question of themes, and maybe to give it a different spin in terms of theme? Are there themes that you've seen in Latin American production that have been sort of like gateways or places that filmmakers have started off? I think, Catherine, you mentioned the B movies in Latin America. Do people get in starting off with the kind of gangbanger type of things, or stories about narcos? Or I'm not sure what are I'm showing. Is there like a place that people start off working because of like expediencies in the market that then become a building block where you can go on and have a bigger and richer career? Are there thematic sort of spaces of opportunity that we should be thinking about?
And I'm skeptical of that, but basically, it's a good question. I mean, actually, it's a phase. The narco is a phase in B production, and there was a whole other. There are other themes in B production, and one of them was female heroism. And the ability to seek justice. And to be doing it across the border. So I think it's kind of interesting that there are different visions, that have been breathed into B filmmaking. And there's much more than meets the eye. And of course, La India Maria, who made a lot of films in the 80s. She's talking more films than anybody, mostly B movies, a lot shown on television. They're still on television. These were comedies. Talking about indigeneity in Mexican culture, and also how indigenous people are seen by North Americans. I think it's probably more possible in television today than in B movies. I think you kind of get isolated in B movies.
Is there any one final comment from anybody else? We all set? We're good. Okay. Well, at the beginning of a conversation, an urgent conversation in an urgent time. Thank you. I think it's my first time saying I want to thank the Academy. I hope it's not my last. But anyways, I do sincerely want to thank the Academy and PST for opening this space and letting us get together and start this conversation. We'll continue it for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Before everybody leaves, I just want to say thank you to Alex and to all our panelists for being here today. Also want to say you've heard about the oral histories. They're all streamable online. You can go to oscars.org and find them on the PST part of the website. There are 13, I believe, or 12 right now. There will be another 13 coming, so check back because we're adding to them. This is a continuum. It will not be the end. It is the seed that has been planted and is sprouting many other fruits. And thank you, Rosalinda, for helping part of the UC Santa Cruz collection come to the Academy Library where it's accessible to future researchers. One other piece that has been added to the collections and to the gift that is PST LALA. And filmmakers everywhere, make sure that things from your history, your collection, your bios are in our library. We want to be inclusive, but sometimes if you've got that extra poster or that extra film print or whatever, bring it to our archive, our library. And those of you who are students here and teachers like Scott, come to see these films, and if you don't have the money, you call me up and you will get in free because we want you here to see these films. This is not a movie theater to make money. This is a movie theater to plant seeds. So please, students, come. We want you here. Teachers, bring your students. Parents, bring your children. Thank you all. Thank you, Lourdes. Talk about seeds, the Mother Earth here planting. And thank you, Ellen, for overseeing this today, as well as a major, huge chunk of all this initiative. Thank you to the staff of the Academy. Dawn Morey, thank you. And have a safe trip. Come back at 7 o'clock.
Oh. Yeah, my name is Barlow. What's your name? Barlow? John. John Cantu. Can I follow you on social media?
You can find me on Facebook.
Okay.
Yeah.
John Cantu?
Yeah.
All right.
I'm holding a